With tensions growing in various regions of the world, it seemed conflict was inevitable. The question was, what would be the spark? Would it be a regional conflict that spiraled out of control? Or would it lead to wars raging across continents? And could the agreements made before be enough to prevent nuclear war? In 2044, the Islamic alliance suffered a major split. The core of the superstate, based around Saudi Arabia, remained with the Islamic alliance. Libya, Sudan, Afghanistan, Baluchistan, and West Pakistan formed a new superstate with greater decentralized power. The split was deemed illegal by Saudi Arabia. However, both sides fearing the CRA and the Islamic Democratic Union, they negotiated a mutual defense pact. For other factions, the new United Islamic Nations and the Islamic Alliance may have mended the schism and reunited under a common banner. The Islamic Democratic Union faced a split as well in 2045. The root causes were numerous, but the biggest issues was the Union's continued heated rhetoric versus the other Middle Eastern superstates, and the Egyptian and Pakistan's refusal to increase power sharing with the non-Egyptian African members. And so, like with the Saudi-centric alliance, several nations left the superstate. Senegal, Gambia, Guinea-Bissau, Mauritania, Algeria, Somaliland, and Tunisia banded together after leaving the IDU and formed the African Democratic Federation. Though with similar motivations as the Islamic Democratic Union, this new superstate sought greater decentralization and a more peaceful foreign policy. The nation to join the European Union was Switzerland. Despite long being seen as the neutral spot in Europe, economic pressures from the EU and a new generation coming to power in the Republic made Switzerland's move to join the rest of Europe possible. Some suggested a contributing factor was that Russia propaganda, showing a Russian-controlled Europe, didn't make an exception for Switzerland. Pole continued to prepare for war, expanding the united military of the Union, including expansive robotic-based ground and air forces. Some politicians, however, wanted to test their military capabilities to be assured of victory against the Russians. Policy week term coming to an end, U.S. President Wooster sought to make a splash on the international scene. New agreements were signed, but not ratified by the hostile Congress, with Japan and the EU seeming to reaffirm old alliances. President Wooster hosted peace talks between Brazil and Peru that eased tensions and prevented the breakout of war between the two nations in 2044. Military Assistance Slush Fund, established by previous presidents, President Wooster contracted and provided military hardware to India, Japan, South Korea, and the Islamic Democratic Union. However, this was not enough to obtain a second term. In the 2044 presidential election, the Republican Party nominated Aaron McCarthy, who tapped Carl Lee, the leader of the White Nationalist Patriot Party, to be his running mate. Without the divide of the two right-leaning parties splitting the vote, McCarthy defeated Wooster in the Electoral College, despite receiving over 10 million fewer votes than Wooster. Despite the policy differences with his predecessor, McCarthy maintained the military assistance to Asia and Africa. What's more, McCarthy began to deploy U.S. troops to Gabon and Angola. The choice of Angola was, for the most part, to help protect the country's oil resources from the GRA. McCarthy was deeply unpopular, and became more so as he did his best to sideline Vice President Lee and his supporters. In exchange for economic development aid and support in preventing a democratic change in power locally, Turkmenistan joined the Russian alliance in 2045. Africa broke the ceasefire in late 2043. Early 2044, the Democratic Republic of Congo was fully annexed, and a few months later, the other Congo was similarly absorbed. Uganda held out slightly longer, but it too fell in 2045. President Akunda's next move was again a two-front conflict. The GRA's alliance with Chad and Zimbabwe came into effect as the three nations went to war versus the Central African Republic and Zambia, making quick work of both countries. Continued aggression by the Grand Republic incited a defensive pact between a number of nations on the border of Nkunda's empire. Several members of the pact gained military assistance from the European Union and the United States. South Africa and China also offered assistance, but in much reduced capacity. In mid-2046, President Nkunda moved troops in place along the borders with the defensive pact members. In August, he ordered troops to cross the border. June of 2046, an incident in eastern Ukraine where several Russian robotic tanks got lost turned the Cold War between the two European blocs hot. The tanks were destroyed, inciting retaliation by the Russians in the form of a bombing run on Kiev. The Europeans' response was to sink several Russian ships in the Baltic. Russian troops were moving over the border, pushing to eastern Ukraine, Georgia, the Baltics, and Finland. Africa's initial push was met with great resistance. However, the battle-hardened troops of the GRA were able to push forward quickly, taking a number of important cities, including Kigoma, Nairobi, and Juba. Still, by mid-spring 2047, the initial push had stalled. Late the previous year, with the collapse of the Western lines, the 4 Western members of the pact made a request to the United States for greater assistance. U.S. President McCarthy, seeking to satisfy several interest groups and distract from the lack of aid to Europe, demanded that these nations surrender themselves to the United States, effectively annexing themselves to the United States, in exchange for assistance. The spark of conflict between the United Islamic Nations and the Islamic Democratic Union was less accidental. The President-Governor of West Pakistan assumed the presidency of the UIN in early 2046 and immediately ordered troops to East Pakistan, declaring East Pakistan a breakaway region and an illegitimate government. This naturally caused open war between the UIN and the Islamic Democratic Union. The other major front of the conflict was in Egypt, with troops from Libya and Sudan pouring into West and South Egypt. Negotiations. By late 2046, the African Democratic Federation had joined the Islamic Democratic Union in their fight against the United Islamic Nations. However, due to the various conflicts, they could only effectively assist on the African front, making quick work of the Western Libyan forces. With the sudden outbreak of war in other parts of the world, China opted to make several bold moves in 2046 to take advantage of the chaos. North Korea, though hypothetically independent, became a semi-autonomous part of the People's Republic of China. In the spring, Mongolia was similarly annexed. The last 2 land grabs in November that sparked off the East Asian conflict. During a spat of political turmoil, China took advantage of the situation in Vietnam and seized the northern part of the country on the excuse of restoring order. The land grab was not acknowledged by the rest of Vietnam, and the remainder of the country quickly overcame the disorder and began mobilizing to oust the Chinese from the north. This in effect activated the Japan Network defensive alliances, though given the power of China, the pact was not willing to move quickly. The troop movements into Tibet similarly spurred a slow response from the India-centric pact. The difficulty of crossing the Himalayas and the weakness of the Nepal and Bhutan militaries. It wasn't until India started bombing raids into China that it was clear that the 2 East Asian superpowers would be at war. Tensions between Brazil and Peru. Brazilian President Sousa did not give up his expansionist rhetoric. Brazil backed a coup in Uruguay, and soon after, in late 2046, the interim government of Uruguay was volunteered by the Brazilian military advisors to be annexed into Brazil. In the fall of 2046, Brazilian troops made a push into Paraguay, seeking to snatch up the small democracy before the other South American nations could make too much of a fuss. They offered a harder resistance to the Brazilians than expected and prevented a quick conquest. With the de facto annexation of several African nations, President McCarthy was seen to be on the rebound. Interventionists and expansionists in Congress were happy with this unusual move and began to push hard to make the annexations fully legal. After a solid win by his party in the congressional elections, President McCarthy seemed likely to be riding high going into the 2048 election. The sidelined Patriot Party and Vice President Lee had other plans. New Year's Day, 2047. Vice President Lee murdered President McCarthy and several cabinet members in the late hours of celebration with the aid of a group of Patriot Party militia and Patriot Party loyal military service members. President Lee made an address to the nation, claiming that it was McCarthy that had attempted to have him and the dead cabinet members killed, but it was only because of his own wit and guile that he survived and did away with President McCarthy. The lie was not bought by most of the country. The invasion of Paraguay remained stalled during most of 2047, though not intervening directly. Many of the other nations on the continent provided support to the Paraguayan government and its military. Money, equipment, and even hosting training camps. As this hard-to-keep secret got back to Brazil's President Sousa, plans were drawn up to expand the conflict, specifically against Argentina, the primary supplier of the Paraguayan forces. East Asia kicked off in earnest in early 2047. The main movement came in the spring with the crossing the Himalayas of the Indian Pact's military forces. The defensive alliance contributed only minor assistance. The Indian government was eager to let Nepal and Bhutan handle the administration of large parts of Tibet. This helped make it clear to the locals that India was not looking to conquer. The Tibetan Front quickly became the most heavily contested in the East Asian conflict, taking up most of China's attention. Myanmar, Vietnam, and Laos made a push back against the Chinese army. Myanmar, the most militant and general of the three governments, was the most successful, pushing hard into Yunnan. In midsummer, Cambodia and Thailand entered the fight, helping push the Chinese nearly entirely out of North Vietnam. Philippine forces landed in Taiwan. The nominally peaceful reuniting with the People's Republic, the island was still a hotbed of anti-mainlander sentiment, especially post-reintegration, due to the numerous broken promises on the matter of civil liberties. Thus, despite the invaders being nominally underpowered, they managed to take control of the island with the help of local forces and friendly local government officials. The other point of primary interest of China was the Korean Peninsula. Though slowly recovering from the Kim regime, North Korea was still generally a highly militarized society, fearful of foreigners, especially South Koreans and Japanese, both of which were technically coming to the aid of Vietnam. And as such, the North Koreans were on high alert for the South to move across the DMZ. At the start of 2048, the South had remained on the far side, and opted to avoid direct conflict with China at that point. Even as their nominal allies to the South were fighting and dying, Japan instead decided to attack Russia. Japan even sent China a message before the first attack. They weren't interested in fighting China or North Korea unless the DMZ was violated. If it didn't encourage the Military Council of North Korea to back down, it did lead the Chinese to move some of their forces to other fronts, much to the distress of the nations actively engaged. Japan's official statement on the move on Russia detailed that it was to aid the European Union in their conflict with the Russians. Sakhalin and the Kurils fell first. Japan made a move on Kamchatka, drawing the Eastern Russian forces to move on the peninsula. However, during this counterattack, mismanagement of the Russian strategy left open an opportunity. Japan moved from Sakhalin to Primorsky Krai. By the end of the year, Japan had seized Vladivostok, taking the Russians' main port to the east. Not long after, most of the remaining Russian ships and subs were either sunk or being chased out of the region. With the naval threat out of the way and a fresh beachhead on the mainland of their own, Japan began to quickly build up their ground troops around Vladivostok. This surprise move caused the leadership in North Korea to prepare an invasion of South Korea, fearing that Japan would soon push south while South Korea pushed north. China, fearing the same, reconsidered their de-escalation in the region and began to strengthen their border defenses. North Korea, however, didn't trust the Chinese to hold Japan at bay, given their losses in the south. To perhaps take out South Korea quickly before Japan was ready to invade. Still, given the Russian counterattacks on the Japanese beachheads, it was clear that such an attack wouldn't be coming anytime soon, giving North Korea extra time to prepare and plan their next move. The fighting in Eastern Europe saw gains and losses from both sides. Russia's hard push on the Baltic states resulted in success in the spring. Georgia and most of Finland were occupied as well. However, the European forces made a hard push in Ukraine, pushing back the Russian tanks and preventing the fall of Kiev. During the fighting, land battles were only a portion of the conflict. The war was destructive as well as bloody. Traditionally manned aircraft and drones filled the skies. It was common in other conflicts of the time that the sheer number of aircraft involved on both sides in the European conflict zone was well above that of other wars. Every hour, every day, for months on end, there were skirmishes in the skies. But in time, the industrial capacity of the main powers of the EU began to win out. By December 2047, European bombers were making raids on Moscow. Lacking the excessive slaughter of the Indian-Chinese front, or the technological terrors in the European war, the fight between the Islamic Democratic Union and the United Islamic Nations was all the same quite intense. The conflict featured a mix of conventional armies in conflict as well as guerrilla actions from both sides. The military advantages of the Democratic Union began to yield success. Even if pacifying the seized territory was difficult, the fact that the Union's forces were able to defeat the United Islamic Nations forces in confrontation after confrontation, it was clear that the Union would be the victorious one in this conflict. The United Islamic Nations to fall was Libya. Split between the African Democratic Federation holdings in the west and the Islamic Democratic Union holdings in the east, Libya was knocked out of the fight before summer of 2047. Given the previous Egyptian annexations in Libya, the Federation was wary of the Egyptian influence on the Union would result in further expansions of that sort. So the Federation made it clear that they would assist the Union further in their conflicts with the UIN if they would negotiate for the liberation of Libya. The response was slow. Discussions on that topic began in late 2048. The fight between the Islamic Alliance and the CRA was less decisive in 2047. While the Saudis made gains in Yemen and Syria, the Iranians moved into Kuwait and even crossed the Persian Gulf, seizing Qatar and the techno-cities of the United Arab Emirates. President Akunda's Grand Republic of Africa continued its multi-front wars through 2047. By the end of the year, Kenya had fallen completely to GRA forces, with Tanzania and South Sudan nearly following suit. On the Western Front, the US-backed support had stopped Akunda's army and even pushed its forces back. However, this new non-internationalist president seizing power in the United States, American support began to be revoked. Iran and Equatorial Guinea were abandoned outright, and once US troops were able to withdraw safely late in the year, they evacuated the two countries, leaving them at the mercy of the GRA. Cameroon was handed off to Nigeria after a deal was struck between the US and Nigeria to gain cheap oil and other resources from the African nation in exchange for the territory and some minor military support against Akunda if his forces were to continue the fight. The US opted to retain control of Angola and the seized territories of the GRA also for resources. Despite the hard move away from gasoline engines in the consumer marketplace, gasoline was still in wide use in the US military, as well as the militaries of the other major powers, and was seen as a strategic resource of importance. With the collapse of the Eastern Front to the GRA and the likely similar story coming from the West, South Africa began seeking defensive alliances with the other southern African nations. Zimbabwe's president meeting with South Africa's resulted in the end of the GRA-Zimbabwe alliance after President Akunda's declared Zimbabwe a nation of traitors, despite no formal agreement being made between the two southern nations. The murder of President McCarthy by Lee sparked mass protests across the United States from both the left and moderate right. Though protests turned to riots after Lee's quick reorganization of the military and the arrest of many members of Congress. Reorganization eliminated non-Lee loyalists from key positions. Many of the generals and commanders, seeing the threat that was coming, went into hiding to wait out and see how things would play out. Some, however, were soon after arrested on trumped-up charges. The show trials of the forced-out military members and imprisoned congresspersons resulted in many executions. The Lee-friendly Supreme Court found itself unable to accept the sudden dictatorial turn of the Lee administration. After losing a minor case that resulted in the overturning of the conviction of a Democratic congresswoman, Lee ordered the arrest and public executions without trial of the majority members of that ruled against him in the Supreme Court. With Congress dead or in prison, Lee's government actively refused to allow replacements to be elected, usually by simply not recognizing the snap replacement elections run by the states, or by the arrest and execution of any non-Patriot Party candidates in the running. The unrest across the United States was not localized to major cities or specific regions. Despite President Lee's attempts to crack down the protests, the citizenry, having long been suffering under the oppression of the one-party state in a semi-limbo where they could speak but not be heard, was quite able to foil many of the plans to stamp out their activities. Having nominal control of the military leadership, many of the lower ranks were unhappy with the turn their country had taken. Even the many of the right wing were becoming unhappy at the violence and brutality of the Lee administration and the active suppression of dissent, even on the right, through violence and murder. Signs of open rebellion started in the late summer of 2047, with Florida Governor Franco Diaz activating his state's National Guard, which was followed by a Patriot Party loyalist purge of its ranks. Despite Diaz being seen as previously quite friendly to the Patriot Party, the abandonment of such a former ally was not seen as out of the ordinary. The Florida Guard was soon after attacked by the U.S. military, and several attempts were made by federal forces to arrest Diaz. To stamp out Diaz's dissent was delayed as other governors began similar moves throughout the fall. First bombing runs against American cities began in November 2047. If not for the unrest throughout the year having caused many to flee the metropolitan areas, the death toll would have been millions more. Between great powers, civil wars, and regional conflicts had by 2048 resulted in tens of millions of deaths in the largest period of conflict since the Second World War.